Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Senate Education. We have with us Secretary of Education Dan French and Counsel for the Agency of Education, Emily Simmons. Thanks so much for being with us, and thanks for all that the two of you are doing as well, Secretary French, your agency. We know everyone is working incredibly hard. Your staff continues to be very helpful to us as we making themselves available as we navigate a number of things on a number of fronts. So thank you for that. I've asked Secretary French and Ms. Simmons to come in just to take us through H315, reminding senators H315, I continue to refer to it as the expedited budget, started in the House. We made a number of different suggestions and changes, went back to the House and the secretary as well as others weighed in on different things. So I thought we might have a conversation just so everyone is up to speed as to where we are at this point. So with that, Mr. Secretary and Ms. Simmons, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. For the record, Dan French, Secretary of Education. Emily Simmons, our General Counsel at the Agency of Education. We have 40 minutes, so happy to use that as productively as you see fit. I think it's fair to say it did go back and forth, H315. We sort of intercepted the ball, if you will, at one point, particularly as we became increasingly concerned about essentially trying to encumber 3 years worth of emergency funding in a matter of weeks. And as we were working with districts to do their needs assessment and embark on the recovery planning, it increasingly became of interest to us that we wanted to get involved in the process and just to alert you from our perspective that things were moving very rapidly. So we tried to get involved also as the technical experts on the use of ESSER funds, which I think you're all familiar with now. In particular, there was interest in using the ESSER state set-aside funds. So in our conversations directly with the policy committee, the House Ed Committee, we embarked on a fairly intensive period of work last week, and Emily was directly involved in that. Basically to try to thread a needle, if you will, to listen to that committee's priorities, but also to look at H315, the amendments that your committee had in the Senate had brought over to that, and try to bring that together in a way that would sort of satisfy ESSER and also support the recovery work at districts, but also acknowledge the priorities of the General Assembly. So I've provided written testimony. I'm not going to speak to it today. I just more or less point you to it as a reference point, because what I just described to you, that threading the needle process, essentially a very intensive 2-day period midweek last week, is what came out of that document that I provided to you. And I will say during those, I think 2.5 days worth of work, House Appropriations also had a representative in the room. So that was, I think, a key part of that process. And I know they've made some progress. I believe Emily's tracked this a little more closely as to what the House has done with this since then. But again, I think this document just provides sort of a good artifact for you as to how, when we mashed all these things up, what was sort of the output that we presented to the committee, then the committee took that from there. But maybe, Emily, if you could just give us a quick update as to where the House is at with this work.
And just to clarify, Mr. Secretary, the document, when senators jump into it, these were, again, the recommendations. This is not where folks landed.
That's correct. This was our testimony that we presented. We were tasked with a very specific, let's say in a collaborative process, where we were asked to sort of try to bring the technical side, the legal piece of it together with what were essentially 3 policy priorities from that committee. And also to, just in the moment of time, trying to bring that down to a place that gave them an actionable work product. But this is not what they ultimately produced. This was sort of how we landed on it. But Emily can sort of
clarify that for the committee, because I know Representative Webb and I had many a conversation last week trying to get to a good landing. So with that, Ms. Simmons.
Sure. So the majority of the work that the other body did in their amendment was taking ESSER appropriations out, and those were taken out at the agency's suggestion. So rather than get into the details, I'll start with telling you what remains. What remains is an influx of funds to the existing indoor air quality program, a new grant for after school program support for after school and summer learning, and then a summer meals program.
Pause there for a moment. Sorry, on the after school. So I know that we asked for $4 million to go to DCF. In the end, after talking with Representatives Hooper and Webb, Senator Kitchell and I decided to do the 50-50 split, 50% to AOE, 50% to DCF, and then there was a change there. Could you just say a little bit about the details of where all that landed?
Absolutely. There was in the Senate amendment a transfer, an appropriation to the Agency of Education that we were directed to transfer to the Department of Children and Families. It was our analysis of ESSER that told us a transfer like that is inappropriate. We are charged at the Agency of Education with oversight of these funds. Secretary French signs the assurances for these funds. So when grants are made, they are more properly from our agency. And so what you see is hopefully accomplishing the same goals, but going through an ESSER compliant channel. So the House did pass a $4 million appropriation for the after school and summer programs. It all goes to the Agency of Education. Within the $4 million, $2 million of that is directed to be made or to grant in consultation between AOE and DCF.
Yeah, and the challenging piece there was the use of the phrase transfer. Again, part of our task was to sort of vet what was being proposed against sort of the technical requirements of ESSER.
So we should feel comfortable that the DCF will have $2 million that to work on some of these programs.
I think a reasonable accommodation was achieved that is also compliant with federal regulations. So,
okay. So I'm sorry, just to clarify. So DCF gets 2 million still.
We will sub-grant to them as opposed to transfer.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
If I could put a really fine point on it, the
Yes,
appropriation is from ESSER funds to the Agency of Education. The purpose for the full $4 million is to be used for grants to after school and summer programs. For $2 million of the $4 million, the grants are to be made in consultation and approval of DCF.
Okay. I know there was some final back and forth there, but that sounds like a good spot to be. Okay.
Right. It means that all $4 million will go to programs that are directly serving kids.
Okay. Thank you. Please continue. You were moving on. I don't remember. We had done air quality, and there was another one.
Summer meals.
Please.
So the language about summer meals is unchanged from the Senate proposal of amendment. It's non-ESSER funds supplementing the summer meals program in a direction to prioritize the use of FEMA funds if possible. There's a little bit of a moving target, and the secretary can speak to this too. The goal is to make the most strategic use of funds, but it's clear that the use is to make sure that students and families have access to nutritious foods in the summer. And that's, again, $5.5 million.
Yeah, and our work with the House Ed Committee, because this wasn't attached directly to ESSER, it was a little easier for us to sort of work through that pretty quickly. Relatively speaking, as Emily alluded to, we did want to retain sort of the maximum flexibility to potentially draw FEMA into play. But this was originally back in January part of a plan to allocate unused CRF funds, the coronavirus relief funds. That was a strategy that the General Assembly had strategized or created before under the CRF appropriations in August.
Thank you. Any questions so far? Okay. Would you mind saying something about, I'm happy to say it if you don't want, but I thought it'd be helpful coming from the two of you, where we landed with literacy dollars?
Yeah, I think literacy is an example, and I was going to bring up school facilities when we were engaging sort of again in a sort of intensive period of 2 days, 2.5 days. We started, part of that conversation started with an understanding of what the committee's priorities were, and not necessarily this committee's priorities, but we had spent quite a bit of time, as we have with you, trying to understand what their priorities were. And literacy was an example of one, a priority that we had brought, the Agency of Education had brought to the table a year ago at least, and similarly with facilities. And they had made some progress on that. So we still have literacy in play, if you will, from a policy perspective, but it's not directly attached to ESSER at this point. So the practical work of last week was really around how to use ESSER funds and the mechanics around that. We fully expect literacy to emerge as a priority for school districts, but right now it's not being attached to statewide ESSER funds. Facilities I can talk about in a minute, but why don't I pause there on literacy, see if Emily has anything to add.
It's our understanding, and I would love to be corrected if this is not right, that there are differences between your committee and the other body's approach to the literacy bill, but that when the policy approach is ironed out, the use of ESSER funds will be re-examined to serve for any funding needs that are in that final version of the legislation. And our testimony last week in the other body demonstrates that there's a way that's appropriate to utilize the ESSER funds for that kind of work. But as the secretary's been saying, it's a threading the needle type exercise to use the almost magic ESSER words to make sure that the use of funds would be seen as appropriate for these federal programs. But we believe it's doable. Yeah. And we'd be happy to provide the technical assistance when you get to that stage.
That would be helpful. The way Senator Kitchell and I left it with Representatives Hooper and Webb was, we're going to take a look today at S14. That is now a merged bill between the two literacy policy positions, if you will. We know that they use some of our language. We used a bit of theirs, and it sounds like we might be getting to a middle ground. If we can get to a middle ground sooner rather than later, I believe that's the hope of both bodies. And then an appropriation will be navigated after that, either using ESSER funds, or it may end up in the big bill, something along those lines. But I believe it's the priority of all four committees to advance this year still. And I know it's yours as well. So thank you for that. And certainly any technical language you can help us with would be most appreciated as we get there.
Yeah, to Emily's point, I mean, as you know, last week we were very focused on trying to, get 315 to move for the committee, and because there wasn't necessarily policy consensus in the area of literacy, more or less the committee just sort of set it aside and worked on the other issues they could advance.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, one thing that you might want to always, if you want to jot this down, Secretary French, you can always tell the House that they can simply concur.
I'll pass that along.
If you want to use that line at any point.
Yeah. They gave me some other message to convey to you, but I lost it between here and the other committee room.
As the Secretary's Counsel, I have to ask, do you need to be credited for that statement, Mr. Chair?
No, I do not.
For use without attribution.
Right.
No, I will. It is fair to say it's relatively easy to work through some of these issues when there's broad consensus that they should be a priority. And I think literacy is one of those. I think facilities is another one. Again, where we interjected ourselves more energetically last week because we were asked to become more directly involved was on the sort of the technical concerns of the ESSER program itself. Once that it became apparent to us that that was being identified as a specific funding source. There are technical aspects to managing those funds that have to be considered. They're a little different than CRF. But again, I fully expect if there's interest to move on literacy, we'd be happy to do that last piece and just make sure it complies with the magical language, as Emily referred to it, if ESSER's tagged as a funding source.
Great, thank you for that.
I was going to mention facilities a bit. Facilities, almost very similar conversation. And I believe I'm scheduled to come discuss tomorrow H426. which is the school construction bill. Again, an example of a policy idea that's been on the table for at least a year, if not longer. And last year, I think we were trying to make some progress on doing a study statewide, essentially an inventory of the conditions of schools. And what emerged this year with COVID, as I said to the committee when I testified on 426, pretty much everything we're looking at now through the lens of COVID. In particular, there's potentially some significant federal dollars coming into play to address school facilities issues. So we, in the context of looking at 315 and facilities, they more or less set that aside for the moment, knowing that there was a school construction policy conversation happening, and this intersection between what I'll call deferred maintenance and construction. The two aren't the same necessarily, but I throw into the bigger pot around the conversation of school facilities improvement is a policy conversation. I think we'll have more tomorrow. But it was one, again, that was included in the written document I provided today because it was one of their priorities, and we wanted to make sure anything they had identified as sort of the big three priorities. That was some of our tasking that went on one day. They said, make sure you address these three priorities when you come back. It clearly was sort of set aside as part of the 315 conversation because it doesn't necessarily belong in there, but it does belong on the table relative to use of federal dollars. So that's why it was included.
Any questions on any of those items? Okay. Any other comments from the two of you before I just shift to just raise another topic, but no need to comment on it now? Any other questions related to 315?
I don't think so. As Emily provided a summary of kind of where things are at, I'm just looking through, I've sort of just said where we ended on that, the idea of, how this is going to play out from a planning process. I think we do have the immediate need to get some money out the door. You use after school as an example. I think we've all agreed that that's a good idea. But at the same time, we are at sort of this moment where we are allowing and need to allow districts to sort of do that needs assessment so that we can start to understand what the priorities are. So to a certain extent, it's premature to identify what the needs are. We can all anticipate that after school, summer school, they'll all be part of a portfolio of tools that districts will need to leverage to address the needs, pandemic needs of kids. But at the same time, we just, trying to put a pause a bit on this so that we can understand what the needs are of the districts and let those needs really inform how we move forward with identifying state level priorities.
Thank you. That's a good reminder that we did have dollars in there for truancy, mental health services, and it was recommended that, as we've been told by I believe, your staff and others, this needs assessment is being done by schools across the state and is coming back to all of you on the 15th, I believe.
Yes, the deadline is April 15th.
Okay. And these needs assessments will include things such as the truancy issue we talked about, mental health services, things like that?
Yeah, we have 3 focus areas that they're required to do a needs assessment in. One of them is social emotional learning, and that's the mental health focus area. We have another focus area on what we're calling re-engagement, which is where the truancy issue resides. And then the third domain is academics. So at this, we're looking for a broad brush needs assessment at this point, just to understand what the general patterns are, and we'll seek to refine that going forward. But I think it'll be useful at this moment in time to inform our planning, both at the local level and at state level.
So if I may, are these going to principals or superintendents?
It's a district level needs assessment. So we required each supervisory union or supervisory district to have a recovery team. And it's that team's job to sort of organize the needs assessment. So it'll be coming from essentially the superintendents.
Okay. And you posed it as broadly as you just mentioned. Here, we know that these are needs. Tell us generally in a narrative format what those are, maybe put some numbers, but you left it to them to basically come up with explaining their needs as well as a plan, or just broad strokes in terms of their needs?
Yeah, the first step is we have a sort of a general template that we're asking them to use. Again, it's sort of like the first cut. We want to understand now kind of what the needs, the patterns of the needs. So first thing they'll do is they'll do that needs assessment, and then we will work with them to develop the priorities from that. So we have a team organized to support each supervisory union in the state. That's also the place where other state agencies will intersect, whether it be DCF or mental health. But we'll look across the state, help them identify priorities, and then through the month of April into May, they translate those priorities from their needs assessment into an actual plan, a recovery plan. And that plan is a requirement of ESSER 3. It also will be helpful to intersect with other federal dollars that they'll have on the table in the month of May, namely the title grants, which is a process that usually starts in May. So the idea is to have some basic prioritization and planning in place that can help inform and coordinate the federal dollars that are available to assist districts with this work.
Mr. Secretary, two things. First of all, if possible, if you wouldn't mind just sharing with Jeannie that template, if that's something, so we can.
Sure. I believe Deputy Secretary Boucher has testified on this behalf and presented the whole framework, but we're happy to make sure you have it.
Perfect.
Yep.
If, as long as we have, I miss seeing the template. I would like to see it.
Yep.
Secondly, do you feel as though, I mean, what you're talking about is an awful lot of work for your agency, and I just want to make sure that, you know, you all feel or have the capability to hire people when you need to hire people, shift things around. I mean, what you're describing from where I'm sitting, that's a heavy lift, and just want to check in generally on that.
Yeah, I mean, we're very careful to situate, you know, the recovery work as being the dominant work. So, for example, we have district support teams that were organized for the federal school improvement plan under ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. So we have already had a continuous improvement planning team structure in place at the agency. We are co-opting those teams to now support districts in the recovery process. There are areas where we do stress under this work, and the one that's probably not on your radar, which is on the radar of every state agencies right now, is a program called EANS, which is the Emergency Relief for Non-Public Schools, the independent school program. Particularly under ESSER 3, that program requires us to stand up sort of almost a direct purchasing program with each independent school. So that's going to be a little different piece of work than the sub-granting process that we normally do. So far, so good. We've stood that up. But I think in terms of the general support at this point, you know, again, the needs assessment should inform that. Another reason why we want to preserve some flexibility with the state level ESSER funds. If we do need to scale up capacity to address certain things, I want to have the funding available to do that. We are planning, and as I talk about facilities, we are planning with contracting out for some services to help districts spend their money essentially in the area of facilities improvement. We intend to use ESSER 2 funds to do that, but that's an example of us sort of anticipating the need, contracting out for additional capacity as necessary. We expect to see a needs emerge. Talk about truancy or areas of integrated service delivery models with mental health and so forth. Want to ensure we don't expend, again, our ESSER 2 set-aside funds too quickly before we know what those needs are. But so far, so good. But it's been the whole year's been like that. I mean, we've scaled up lots of programs to manage throughout the year and have done that fairly successfully so far.
Senator Persily.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to, and maybe you said this and I kind of missed it, Secretary French, is that I agree with the needs assessment. I just, on the summer programs, I want to make sure that the word is getting out to programs that, you know, that their grants are going to be coming. Because I know both parents and people that run summer programs are already planning now. And if they knew there was a grant, maybe they would start, you know, figuring out who they're going to hire and find people and stuff like that. So I wouldn't want to wait too long, because of the summer programs start so quick and it takes a while just to get people to know about them, and yeah. I just don't want to miss that opportunity. But I think
no, it's a good point. I mean, we've been planning from the administrative side to launch a major summer school initiative, and the funding's a key part of that. You know, we're working closely with Vermont After School, DCF, and other state agencies. Today's announcement at the press conference was sort of the first step in that, was to sort of articulate from the governor's standpoint how the rest of the reopening will go through the 4th of July. We did issue some brief guidance last week to signal that school facilities would be open and available for summer programming. So we have to send some signals to the marketplace, to the businesses that are operating in this area. And we anticipate making it sort of the major unveiling on the summer school initiative on this Friday. It's all part of that recovery piece. And we know time is of the essence, but it's been hard to sort of predict the future relative to the virus. We have a pretty, I think, very confident trajectory now due to the vaccination data and the supplies being confirmed on a regular basis. So we feel very comfortable that the summer will be, don't say close to normal. There's going to be some mitigation processes and so forth that are required. But the funding's a key piece. And we have to, districts also have funding available. All that has to come to bear to scale up to the extent there's student interest too. So again, the needs assessment's a critical piece.
Great, thanks. Good to hear about that you could announce that the schools will be open. Thank you.
Yeah, I think summer's on, of course, everyone's mind, and I think we'll probably have either you or someone from the agency, as well as Ms. Morehouse, back in a few weeks, just to see, as we get closer to May, what things are looking like, what might be needed, if anything, from all of us, and how things are going. So appreciate that. Anything else? Okay. You're not scheduled, I don't believe Jeannie has scheduled you for this yet, but we have, if I may just shift for a moment to the state board, and there is a back and forth around, I don't want to call it the state board miscellaneous education bill, but I think you know what I'm talking about. They've got a number of things that they would like to do around powers and responsibilities. And there's conversation about the likelihood, if we could get some agreement between you and Mr. Carroll, that we would move something in a government operations bill. So I don't know if that is something that you think is something we could get to or not, but it's on our plate, and just wondering if that's something you think we could do.
Yeah, I think it is the way I think tomorrow's testimony invitation was put to me was school construction and state board. So, but I'm happy to discuss it. From us, from our standpoint, the agency standpoint, it's not about the state board. It's about what is the regulatory framework and the need to adjust the regulations. And for us, it's really some observations, certainly happy to share, and where we've been in the last couple of years with Act 46, Act 173, and certainly Act 77, which has been proficiency-based learning. But there, the issue of construction, which we'll talk about tomorrow, there's just a number of outdated rules that need to be refreshed, shall we say. But the broader regulatory framework, from my perspective as secretary, and it's just an observation, doing this work now for a couple of years, that the General Assembly made the change from commissioner to secretary for a purpose, and there's another half of that work from my perspective that needs to be examined, and that's about regulatory authority. And where we ended up last year on this topic, I think there is the state board, to its credit, coming out of the incredible work they did with Act 46, was starting to look at their, what do we do next? Sort of a moment, if you will, existential moment for them as to what's our purpose, and really did some good work. And they were coming out of a retreat, and they started to identify updating their regulations. And then coincidentally, the sunset group that the legislature appointed to examine the purpose and trajectory of all committees was created. And the state board got caught up in that sort of examination. And that led to testimony on, how to sort of defensively justify the position of the state board. But I come at it from a slightly different angle, I think, which is not so much not trying to defend or promote the role of the state board, but just to promote the idea that the regulatory structure needs more coherence in education. And um, we ended up in a place in this committee last year, which I would agree has sort of been a negotiation, and I would say unfairly, between myself and Chair Carroll. It's not, from my perspective, there's a logic behind it that is or isn't correct, and it's not a question of us coming to agreement and negotiating something. Like, I don't think as secretary in this temporal situation in this moment in time that this fundamental regulatory issue should be decided on what I think personally is the way to go. I think it's just a continuation of work that the General Assembly should embark upon at some point. It's never sort of been a front burner issue for me per se, particularly in COVID. So happy to engage in it more, but it's not about the role of the state board, though it does point to ultimately what is the role of the state board. It's more about the regulatory construct and who's accountable, what's the purpose of regulation relative to the statutory language. And I think as a state, I make the observation as a long-serving educational leader in the state that we have a fairly high-quality K-12 education system. It's not because of our regulatory framework; it's almost in spite of it. So I'm interested in improving that, particularly from a perspective of quality and equity. I think that is a fundamental role for the state, and I'll touch upon it a bit tomorrow when I talk about facilities, because I think this is an area that's symptomatic of a weak regulatory structure, and I see facilities as sort of being a central precondition for an quality educational experience. And school facilities need to be of a certain minimal quality condition if students are going to learn. And we've let that slide over the years precisely because our regulatory framework is fairly weak in that regard.
Well, I appreciate those comments, and also recognize that this might not be understandably at the top of the list right now. And I'm not going to push it to be at the top of the list. If this is something where the state board and the agency feel like it's time to advance, great, we have a vehicle to do it. If this isn't the time, that's fine as well.
Yeah, and I made the observation last year, if I'll just add that what was essentially, I would say, negotiated down, I made the comment that I'd rather stay with what we have as opposed to creating another sort of arbitrary sort of regulatory framework. I don't say arbitrary, but it's important right now, I would say, similar to the approach we took with freezing ADM last summer, to introduce some element of stability into a very uncertain financial and budgetary situation for school districts. I'm not overly excited about introducing yet another variable of change for school districts precisely at the moment when we're really trying to unpack an unprecedented pandemic. We're also trying to live under Act 46. And as you know, there are number of districts contemplating divorce or dissolution. And really the policy priority before us right now is Act 173 and special ed reform, which is totally consistent with the recovery work. So I think the regulatory piece is critical. Just not sure how do we pick this up and get it going at this moment in time. And I think it will require a lot of stakeholder engagement, which honestly, that was another piece I was dissatisfied with last year. It was really a three-way conversation between myself, the chair, and the committee. And the state board itself took little testimony on this topic, and a lot of Vermonters, I think, should weigh in on what is a critical aspect of our education system.
Okay. Any questions or comments for either Secretary French on any of these topics or Ms. Simmons? Thank you both very much. Look forward to seeing one or both of you tomorrow.
Yeah, I think it'll be me and Cassandra Ryan, who's our sort of technical expert on construction. What I'll try to do tomorrow, though, is I'm going to sort of bring together the facilities piece that's in this document I shared today with the prior testimony on construction. Again, I think construction and deferred maintenance kind of come together to a certain extent. But to what extent the General Assembly wants to leverage the one-time federal dollars that are before us, which I would strongly encourage you to consider as being the priority right now in terms of construction or improvement of facilities. I think the construction bill would need to be modified as a vehicle if that is a common goal that we share.
Okay. Okay. We'll look forward to that tomorrow. Thank you both.
Thank you. Good to see you guys. Take care.
Committee, let's come back at 3 o'clock and ready to jump in